inside a hangar crowded with shareholders. CEO Amelia Carter laughed when Jackson Wyatt, a single father in faded maintenance coveralls, said he could save the private jet with a $22 hydraulic valve. She tore the repair ticket apart in front of everyone, fired him on the spot, and called it a cheap trick from a mechanic. Jackson said nothing. He set the small valve on the table and walked away without looking back. 3 weeks later, the entire fleet sat grounded, contracts collapsed overnight, and Amelia arrived at his front door carrying $22 million, begging him to return. Stay until the very end to discover why Jackson refused the fortune that could have changed his entire life forever. Carter Meridian Aviation stood at the edge of a Dallas runway, its glass offices catching the late morning sun, while its executives prepared to close a defense transport contract worth hundreds of millions of dollars. The demonstration flight had been staged inside the main hangar, arranged for the board, a cluster of investors, and a delegation from the client company who had flown in specifically to watch the jet perform. The aircraft at the center of it all was the CM-9, the flagship of the fleet and the company's proudest asset. Minutes before the scheduled taxi, a warning light flared across the cockpit display, flagging a hydraulic pressure fault in the landing gear control system. The maintenance crew replaced a sensor, inspected the lines, and restarted the flight computer twice. Yet the warning kept returning. Connor Hayes, the operations director, moved through the hangar with the calm of a man who disliked delays more than he disliked mistakes. He proposed grounding the flight and replacing the entire control assembly, a repair that would cost nearly $180,000 and require parts that would not arrive for at least 5 days. A delay of that length threatened to cost Carter Meridian the contract entirely. Jackson Wyatt worked quietly near the maintenance bay, unnoticed by the gathering crowd of decision-makers. He did not join the arguments swirling around him. Instead, crouched beside the forward landing gear and studied a thin trace of fluid pooling beneath the housing, watching how it gathered rather than how it dripped. He noticed something the others had missed. The pressure was not falling in the steady, continuous pattern of a cracked line. It fluctuated only once the system reached a particular temperature threshold, a detail that pointed towards something smaller and stranger than a structural failure. Jackson asked to review the maintenance history, but Connor refused, reminding him that a contract technician had no clearance for that kind of access. Lucas Bennett, the veteran captain assigned to the flight, knew Jackson's background well enough to trust his instincts. Quietly, without asking permission, he handed Jackson a printout of the flight data logs. Within minutes, Jackson traced the fault to a single balance valve, likely jammed by a rubber seal cut to the wrong dimension for the housing it sat inside. The replacement valve cost $22. Jackson proposed swapping the valve, running a pressure test, and only then deciding whether the larger assembly needed to come apart at all. Connor mocked the suggestion openly, calling it beneath the moment. Before he could dismiss Jackson entirely, Amelia Carter stepped into the hangar and demanded to know exactly what was happening. Jackson stood there holding the small valve in his palm, facing the young CEO and the entire assembled board. Connor introduced Jackson to the room in the most diminishing way he could manage, describing him as a temporary technician who wanted to fix a $60 million jet with a part that cost less than a dinner out. The description drew a ripple of laughter from several investors who had no context for what they were watching. Amelia felt the weight of the board pressing on her from every direction. She had inherited the company during a period of rapid expansion, and she lived with a constant fear that any misstep would confirm what certain board members already suspected, that she was too young and too inexperienced to run an aviation company of this size. Letting an unranked technician override her senior engineers in front of a defense client felt, to her, like handing over control she could not afford to lose. Jackson explained the situation plainly. The valve was not fully destroyed. Its internal seal had swollen after prolonged contact with hydraulic fluid that did not match the required specification. If the valve were replaced and the short section of line cleaned properly, the system should stabilize without further intervention. He added a warning that reached beyond the single aircraft. If substandard fluid had been used on the CM-9, other jets in the fleet could be carrying the same hidden risk. Connor cut him off before Amelia could respond, declaring that Jackson was speculating without evidence. He handed her a report certifying that every fluid and part in inventory met required standards. Wanting to project decisiveness in front of the investors, Amelia looked down at the $22 repair ticket and laughed. She asked Jackson if he genuinely intended to stake the company's reputation on something bought off a parts store shelf. Jackson answered calmly that the price of a component said nothing about the accuracy of a diagnosis. The response landed as a challenge, and Amelia refused to let it stand unanswered. She tore the repair ticket in half, ordered Connor to replace the entire control assembly, and ended Jackson's contract on the spot. Lucas started to speak up in Jackson's defense, but Jackson raised a hand to stop him. He placed the new valve on the tool table, gathered his equipment, and walked out of the hangar without another word. Before he reached the door, he turned back toward Amelia and told her that a new control assembly would not fix the actual cause of the failure. Then he added a final warning. No aircraft in the fleet should fly again until every drop of hydraulic fluid had been tested. Connor scoffed openly at the suggestion. Amelia said nothing in return, though something about the steadiness in Jackson's voice left her unsettled long after he had gone. Once the hangar had emptied, Connor quietly lifted the $22 valve from the tool table and dropped it into a scrap bin. Before anyone could log the request, he deleted the fluid inspection order from the maintenance system entirely. Carter Meridian spent nearly $180,000 replacing the control assembly on the CM-9. Within 2 days, the aircraft passed every ground inspection and was declared fully operational once again. Connor used the result to prove that Jackson had been wrong. Amelia tried to push away the flicker of guilt she felt over how she had ended his contract in front of everyone. During a test flight, Lucas noticed the hydraulic pressure fluctuating again as the aircraft descended. The warning cleared within seconds, so Connor dismissed it as a minor software glitch, nothing worth reporting. 3 days later, a second aircraft showed the identical symptom during a flight out of Denver. A third followed shortly after, departing from Phoenix. Every one of these jets had recently gone through routine maintenance at facilities under Connor's direct oversight. One pilot was forced to abort takeoff entirely when the forward landing gear failed to lock into position. No one was hurt, but footage of passengers evacuating onto the tarmac spread quickly and drew unwanted attention to the company. Federal aviation regulators requested Carter Meridian's full maintenance records. The defense client quietly postponed signing their contract. Insurance underwriters began asking pointed questions about the company's inspection history. Amelia called an emergency meeting. Connor insisted the incidents were unrelated and pushed for a company-wide replacement of hydraulic control assemblies, a repair that would cost millions of dollars across the fleet. Lucas objected. He described Jackson's original warning in detail and argued that every aircraft needed its hydraulic fluid tested immediately, not just the parts already under suspicion. Connor countered that Jackson was simply retaliating after being fired. He produced a personnel file suggesting Jackson had left a senior engineering position under circumstances that were, in his words, unclear. Amelia asked Jessica Miller, the head of legal, to look into Jackson's background. Jessica discovered that Jackson had not been dismissed from his previous company at all. He had served as chief reliability engineer at a major aviation equipment manufacturer responsible for hydraulic systems across an entire fleet. After his wife passed away, he had voluntarily stepped down, turning down an executive promotion in favor of contract work close to home so he could raise his daughter without the demands of constant travel. More striking still, Jackson's name appeared on 2 patents related to diagnosing contamination in hydraulic fluid systems, work that had shaped industry standards years before Carter Meridian ever hired him. Amelia realized with a growing unease that she had mocked and dismissed the one person in the building most qualified to catch the failure before it spread. Amelia sat alone in her office that evening, replaying the moment she had torn the repair ticket in half. She had wanted to look decisive in front of people who doubted her, and instead she had silenced the one voice that understood the problem better than anyone else in the building. Then the call came in from an independent laboratory. The fluid sample pulled from the CM-9 contained an industrial additive that had no approval for use in any aviation hydraulic system, a substance cheap enough to explain why someone might have chosen it over the standard formulation. The laboratory results forced Carter Meridian to voluntarily ground all 18 aircraft in its fleet, a preemptive move meant to avoid a far harsher order from federal regulators. Flights were canceled in waves. The company scrambled to charter aircraft from competitors just to serve its most important clients, and every day of the grounding drained hundreds of thousands of dollars from the balance sheet. Amelia demanded that Connor explain how substandard fluid had entered the system in the first place. He blamed a small supplier, suggesting the whole failure might trace back to a single mislabeled shipment rather than anything deliberate. Jessica dug further and discovered that the supplier in question had been formed less than 2 years earlier and held financial ties to a company controlled by Connor's younger brother. Connor moved quickly to bury the trail. He fired a warehouse manager named Ryan, claiming the man had purchased cheaper materials on his own initiative without authorization. Ryan denied the accusation, but he had no access to the records that could have cleared his name. He packed his belongings from a small locker near the parts room and left the property that same afternoon, still insisting to anyone who would listen that he had followed every purchasing order exactly as written. Meanwhile, engineers across the company disassembled dozens of valves and seals. They found that the wrong additive had caused the rubber components to swell unpredictably, producing intermittent jamming that came and went without warning. Replacing a single control assembly could never have solved the problem, because the contaminated fluid remained circulating through the rest of each aircraft's system. Jackson's warning had been correct in every detail. Amelia tried calling him, but he did not answer. She sent an email requesting a meeting, and his reply arrived short and unadorned, stating simply that he had already delivered the diagnosis when it still could have been solved for $22. At almost the same moment, the defense client formally withdrew from the agreement. 2 corporate clients demanded refunds. The insurance carriers signaled they would deny coverage for any losses tied to safety warnings that leadership had chosen to ignore. The projected total damage climbed rapidly toward $22 million, a figure built from grounded operations, chartered replacement flights, refunds, system-wide inspections, and the collapsed contract that had started it all. Reporters began camping outside the corporate offices, and every evening brought another headline questioning whether Carter Meridian could survive the fallout. The board demanded that Amelia step aside temporarily while the company addressed the crisis. Connor postured as her ally in these discussions, though privately he hoped she alone would absorb the blame for everything that had gone wrong. Lucas handed Amelia a copy of flight data he had quietly preserved on his own. Buried inside were Jackson's original diagnostic notes, time-stamped alongside the exact moment Connor had ordered the fluid inspection request deleted from the system. Reading through the timeline late into the night, Amelia understood that what she was looking at was no longer a simple maintenance failure. It looked increasingly like something organized from within the company itself, built patiently over months by someone who had every reason to keep it hidden. After his contract ended, Jackson took temporary work at a small repair shop run by an old friend named Samuel. He carried no bitterness about what had happened, but he had no intention of ever returning to Carter Meridian. He had spent more than 15 years studying failures inside hydraulic systems, and he understood better than most how a single overlooked valve could cascade into catastrophe once the people making decisions valued their reputation more than the data in front of them. His wife had died after a long illness, and the loss had taught him that no title was worth the time it stole from his family. He had walked away from a path toward upper management and chosen shift work instead, so he could raise his daughter without the demands of constant travel and late meetings. Ella appeared in his life during a short call one evening. She asked why he no longer wore the uniform from his old job. Jackson did not tell her about the humiliation in the hangar. He only said that sometimes a person has to leave a place that no longer trusts what he knows. After the call ended, Samuel urged Jackson to release everything he knew publicly, insisting it would protect his reputation and force Carter Meridian to answer for what had happened. Jackson refused to turn a crisis into a chance for revenge. He wanted the investigators to have the truth, nothing more and nothing less. Amelia arrived at the small repair shop alone, without an assistant or a lawyer trailing behind her. It was the first time she had faced Jackson somewhere. Her authority carried no weight at all. She stood in the doorway of the small shop for a long moment before speaking, watching him work on an old engine cover as though the crisis outside had nothing to do with him. She admitted she had been wrong and asked him to come back as an emergency consultant. Jackson declined without looking up from his work. She offered $1 million. He still declined. She raised the offer to $2 million and promised him complete technical authority over the fleet. Jackson asked whether Ryan, the warehouse manager who had been blamed and dismissed, had been cleared and made whole yet. Amelia had no answer for him. Jackson explained that the problem went deeper than any single hydraulic system. The culture inside Carter Meridian had become dangerous in a quieter way, one where a person with a higher title was always trusted over a person with better evidence. He would not come back simply to save her position as chief executive. That, to him, was the least important thing at stake in the entire ordeal, far less urgent than the safety of every passenger who still trusted the company's aircraft. Before she left, Jackson handed her a list of records that needed reviewing: fluid invoices, shipment numbers, warehouse access logs. The date seals had last been replaced in every instance where Connor had altered an official report. He accepted no money that day, but he gave her something else instead, a real chance to uncover the truth on her own. Later that night, going through the invoices Jackson had pointed her toward, Amelia found that every questionable shipment of fluid had been personally approved by Connor, each one arriving just before the company quietly received a hidden refund from the very supplier that had sold it. Amelia, Jessica, and Lucas quietly formed their own investigative team, uncertain how many people inside the company Connor still controlled. Jessica recovered a stream of deleted messages. Inside them, she found evidence that Connor had pressured the purchasing department into using an industrial-grade fluid far cheaper than the certified aviation formula, then falsified the quality certificates to hide the substitution. The difference in cost had been funneled through several shell companies, each one dissolved and replaced before regulators could take much notice. Connor had personally profited millions of dollars from the scheme, while the slow degradation of the rubber seals happened gradually enough that he believed no one would ever trace it back to him. He had built the arrangement over years, confident that the failures would always look like ordinary wear rather than deliberate sabotage. Once the first warnings surfaced, Connor had planned to push for a full replacement of the control assemblies at an inflated price. The company supplying those replacement parts also belonged to his network, allowing him to profit twice, once from the faulty components and again from the expensive repairs required to fix the damage they caused. Jackson agreed to review a portion of the evidence at a neutral location. He confirmed that the pattern of failures matched exactly with the type of contamination the laboratory had identified. He warned, however, that replacing the fluid and the seals alone would not be enough. Degraded rubber particles could still linger inside the accumulators and return lines, causing valves to jam months later even after the visible damage had been addressed. To restore the fleet safely, the company would need to flush the entire hydraulic system section by section, replace every affected component, and build a new inspection protocol from the ground up. The estimated cost approached $22 million. Amelia realized that the $22 million figure was not a sum meant to buy Jackson's forgiveness. It was the actual cost of repairing the consequences of laughing at a $22 solution months earlier. Connor discovered that Amelia was investigating him. He leaked a story suggesting the young chief executive had ignored technical warnings and was now searching for subordinates to blame for her own failures. Shareholders who had once championed Amelia's leadership grew quiet, waiting to see which way the vote would fall. The board called an emergency session to vote on removing Amelia from her position. Jackson still refused to return formally, but he agreed to provide technical testimony. He made it clear that he was doing this for the safety of pilots and passengers, not out of any loyalty to Amelia personally. While preparing the evidence together, Amelia began to see the real man behind the composure Jackson had shown in the hangar. He was demanding but never arrogant, able to explain complicated failures using simple principles, and he never once used her weakened position to settle a score. Jackson, in turn, noticed that Amelia was not quite the cold executive he had first assumed. She had made a serious mistake out of pride, but she was now willing to risk her own career to correct it, choosing accountability over the easier path of denial. Late that night, Connor gave a quiet order to move an aircraft that had not yet been cleaned out of the hangar before federal investigators arrived to seal it. Connor ordered a subordinate to move the CM-12 to another facility under the pretense of avoiding storage fees. In truth, the aircraft still carried electronic maintenance records that could prove the falsified fluid certifications beyond any doubt. Lucas discovered the plan just as the engines were starting. He immediately alerted Amelia and Jackson. Amelia demanded the aircraft be stopped, but Connor had already used his emergency operational authority to approve the transfer flight, insisting the CM-12 had not shown any of the serious symptoms found in the other jets. Moments after takeoff, the pilot reported an abnormal rise in pressure within hydraulic system B. The landing gear failed to retract fully, and the fluid temperature continued climbing steadily. Jackson was not aboard the aircraft. He was brought into the operations room alongside Lucas to guide the crew from the ground. Studying the pressure data being relayed in real time, Jackson recognized that the return valve was partially jammed. If the pilot kept forcing the gear to retract, the rising heat would soon damage the pump beyond repair. He instructed the crew to shut down the auxiliary pump, reduce airspeed, leave the landing gear exactly where it was, and turn back toward the airport. These instructions were not an attempt to repair the aircraft remotely. They were meant only to bring the system into a safer, more stable state until it could land. In the operations room, the silence stretched painfully, as everyone watched the pressure readings tick across the monitors. Amelia stood beside Jackson, saying nothing, letting him work without interruption for the first time since she had known him. Connor tried to pressure the Flight Operations Center into ordering the pilot to continue toward a different airport, terrified that the aircraft might be seized by investigators if it landed at its home base. Amelia stripped him of operational authority right there in the control room, in front of the entire staff. The CM-12 returned and landed safely. Emergency crews stood ready on the tarmac, though no accident occurred. Applause broke out quietly among the ground staff as the aircraft rolled to a stop, relief spreading through the operations room like something physical. When technicians removed the return valve afterward, they found a seal deformed in exactly the pattern Jackson had warned about months earlier. Federal investigators sealed the aircraft immediately. The data inside proved that Connor had known about the underlying problem for at least 6 months before it became public. Connor attempted to leave the airport grounds but was stopped before he could get far. Jessica handed over the complete body of evidence to the appropriate authorities, including the financial transfers, the falsified certifications, and the deleted inspection order. Amelia stood before reporters and accepted responsibility for ignoring the original warning. She refused to use Connor as an excuse to erase her own part in what had happened. She told the gathered press that a technician had tried to prevent a disaster using a $22 part, and that the leadership above him had chosen to protect its own image instead of listening to him. After her statement, the board suspended Amelia from her position pending a full review. But for the first time since the day she had fired him, Jackson picked up the phone and called her himself. Jackson met Amelia inside the hangar that had since been closed to the public. No shareholders, no cameras, no assistants trailing behind her. Only 18 grounded aircraft sitting silent and hundreds of employees whose jobs now hung in the balance. Their footsteps echoed against the concrete floor as they walked past the idle jets, each one wrapped in caution tape and inspection notices. Amelia told him she had not called him back to save her own position. Even if the board removed her permanently, she wanted the fleet repaired the right way, and she wanted the innocent employees who had done nothing wrong to stop paying for decisions made above their heads. The board had approved an emergency fund of $22 million, yet no engineer wanted to sign their name to a recovery plan when the system had been compromised so extensively. Amelia asked Jackson to lead the restoration program, not as a contracted technician this time, but with complete independent authority over every decision. Jackson laid out 5 conditions before he would agree to anything. Ryan and every other employee wrongly blamed had to be fully reinstated and properly compensated for what they had endured. Every record uncovered during the investigation had to go directly to federal authorities with no private settlement used to bury any part of it. A portion of the recovery budget had to fund a technician training program and formal protections for anyone who reported safety concerns in the future. Safety decisions from that point forward had to be based strictly on data, never on rank or title. And Amelia herself had to accept that Jackson could ground any aircraft at any time without needing her approval first. She listened to each condition without interrupting, writing nothing down, simply nodding as though she had already expected every one of them. Amelia agreed to every condition without hesitation. Jackson still hesitated, aware that the role could pull him back into the demanding executive life he had deliberately walked away from years earlier. Amelia offered to build a flexible schedule around his needs and to establish a technical leadership team so the entire burden would never rest on him alone. She apologized once more, this time without an amount attached to it and without trying to explain her way out of what she had done. Jackson agreed to return for 6 months as an independent director overseeing fleet reliability and safety. He made it clear that Amelia had not purchased his return with $22 million. What she had proven instead was a willingness to spend that same amount correcting the damage her own choices had caused. This moment marked a genuine shift between them. Amelia began treating Jackson as an equal rather than a resource to be managed, and Jackson began to believe that she was capable of real change, not simply damage control dressed up as remorse. Later that day, Jackson retrieved the $22 valve that Lucas had quietly rescued from the scrap bin weeks earlier. He set it inside a glass case at the center of the operations floor, where everyone walking through would see it. Jackson organized 4 specialized teams covering hydraulic engineering, materials science, maintenance technician, and quality auditing. Each aircraft moved through its own dedicated inspection process. All contaminated hydraulic fluid was removed according to strict environmental standards. Lines were flushed thoroughly, filters were analyzed piece by piece, and every affected valve and seal was replaced with certified components. Jackson did not personally repair each aircraft himself. His role was to design the overall process, verify the incoming data, and train the teams to recognize the subtle warning signs that automated reporting systems routinely overlooked. He spent long hours walking the hangar floor, crouching beside technicians to check their work, asking questions rather than issuing orders, and letting each team build confidence in its own judgment. Amelia relocated much of her work to the hangar floor instead of the executive offices. She sat in on technical briefings and slowly learned to ask better questions rather than rushing toward conclusions the way she once had. Between Jackson and Amelia, quieter moments began to form. Late conversations over coffee after long shifts, small gestures of concern when the other pushed themselves too hard, and a growing habit of defending each other's decisions when the board pushed back. Their connection did not grow through obvious flirtation. It grew instead from trust, and from the willingness each of them showed to admit where they had been wrong. Some evenings after the hangar had emptied and only the hum of the ventilation system remained, they lingered in conversation far longer than either of them planned, neither quite willing to be the one who said goodnight first. Connor was formally charged with fraud, falsifying safety records, and obstructing the investigation. Ryan was cleared of all wrongdoing, reinstated to his position, and compensated for what he had endured. After 8 weeks, the first restored aircraft completed every required test. Lucas flew the confirmation flight himself with a federal inspector aboard to verify the results firsthand. The system performed exactly as intended. One by one, aircraft across the fleet were cleared to resume service. The company never recovered the original defense contract, but it kept its operating certificate, avoided collapse, and slowly began rebuilding trust among its remaining clients. The board offered to reinstate Amelia fully, recognizing her cooperation with investigators and her willingness to accept accountability throughout the crisis. She accepted, but only under a new governance structure that gave the technical division real authority to veto any decision affecting safety. Jackson understood by then that Amelia was no longer the woman who had torn up his repair ticket in front of a crowded hangar. She had learned that real leadership was never about appearing infallible. It was about correcting mistakes before they became irreversible. When the very first restored aircraft touched down safely, Amelia did not step forward in front of the cameras waiting outside. Instead, she stepped back deliberately, letting Jackson and the technical teams receive the recognition they had earned through 8 difficult weeks of work. Carter Meridian held a company-wide gathering inside the very hangar where Jackson had once been fired in front of everyone. Rows of folding chairs stretched across the concrete floor where the demonstration flight had once been staged, and the same overhead lights that had lit his humiliation now shone down on a room that had come slowly to see him differently. The $22 valve sat displayed in its glass case beside a printed summary showing how Jackson's early warning could have spared the company $22 million in losses had anyone chosen to listen at the time. Amelia walked onto the small stage without trying to turn the moment into a polished piece of public relations. She described exactly what she had done, laughing at Jackson's diagnosis, tearing apart his repair ticket, and choosing her own pride over the evidence in front of her. In front of employees, board members, and members of the press, she apologized to him directly, her voice steady even as the room stayed completely silent, waiting to see how he would respond. Jackson did not use the moment to embarrass her in return. He said the company's greatest failure had never been about overlooking one technician. It was about building a culture where people were afraid to say the thing their superiors did not want to hear. He spent most of his remaining time crediting the technical teams who had worked thousands of hours to bring the fleet back into safe operation. Amelia offered Jackson the position of vice president overseeing safety and reliability. He did not accept immediately. He insisted the role carry a limited term, a schedule that respected his life outside the company, and no attempt to turn him into a marketing symbol for the brand. The board agreed to every term. Using funds from the recovery budget, The company launched a technician apprenticeship initiative that came to be known simply as the 22 Initiative, though Jackson insisted his own name never be attached to it. After the ceremony ended, Amelia and Jackson stood together beside the fully restored CM9. Amelia joked that she would never again laugh at an inexpensive repair ticket for as long as she lived. Jackson replied that a low price did not always mean a correct answer, but that pride nearly always came with an enormous cost. For the first time, Amelia laughed without a trace of mockery in it. She asked whether Jackson would be willing to share a meal with her somewhere that had nothing to do with aircraft, lawyers, or board members. He considered it for a moment, then said he thought that sounded like a reasonable idea, the first thing resembling an easy smile crossing his face since the day she had fired him. 6 months later, Carter Meridian had recovered most of its operations. The company was smaller than before, but it had become far more transparent and far safer than it had ever been. Every technical report could now be sent directly to an independent safety committee. No employee faced discipline for grounding a flight over a suspected irregularity, no matter how small it seemed at the time. Jackson completed his 6-month term but agreed to remain on as a senior advisor. He turned down an oversized equity award and chose instead a schedule that let him keep the balance he valued most in his life. Ella made a brief appearance during a family open house held inside the hangar. She noticed the $22 valve resting in its glass case and asked her father why something so small deserved such a prominent place. Jackson told her that sometimes the smallest things are what remind people to listen. Amelia greeted Ella warmly but made no effort to fill the space left by the mother she had lost. She kept a respectful distance, letting whatever bond might form between them grow at its own pace, without pressure from anyone. After the open house ended, Amelia and Jackson walked together along the runway as the sun began to set. Over the months of working side by side, they had shared meals, traded stories from their separate lives, and slowly become people the other could trust without reservation. Amelia admitted that for years she had believed she needed to appear stronger than everyone around her at all times. Jackson told her that real strength was never about being right every time. It was about being willing to return to the place where you had been wrong and fix it properly. Amelia asked whether whatever existed between them could survive now that there was no crisis forcing them to stay close. Jackson made no grand promise in response. He simply took her hand gently and suggested they start with another dinner first. Behind them, the CM9 lifted off the runway, its hydraulic system running exactly as it should. Inside the operations center, the $22 valve still rested beneath its quiet light. Below it, a short line of text remained fixed to the case. The value of a warning was never determined by the title of the person who gave it. Jackson and Amelia walked away from the hangar side by side, not yet a complete family, no proposal spoken between them, but carrying something sturdier than either of those things: genuine trust, mutual respect, and the quiet beginning of something real. A $22 valve almost saved a company that a fortune later failed to buy back. Jackson Wyatt never asked to be believed because of a title or a paycheck. He only ever asked to be heard, and for a long while, no one in that hangar was willing to listen. What changed everything was not the money Amelia Carter eventually offered, but the moment she chose to face her own mistake instead of hiding behind it. Real leadership was never about looking certain in front of a crowd. It was about having the courage to walk back into the room you once ruled poorly and make it right. If this story reminded you that the quietest voice in a room is sometimes the one worth trusting most, carry that lesson with you and thank you for staying until the very end.